Okay. So, look, Mark, delighted to have you here with us with the Institute this afternoon, and thank you very much for your time and courtesy. I know you're very busy, and we're really kind of delighted to have this opportunity to catch up with you. And equally, just at the outset, to thank both yourself and Edward and the guys and BoardEffect and Diligent for your support over the last year, and looking forward to working with you again next year. So, guys, we were just chatting to Mark, and we're looking forward maybe to do an in-person event with Diligent over the year ahead, in camera for members exclusively, and we're looking forward to that. That should be interesting. So, more news about that in due course. And the Institute has gone from strength to strength over the last period. We've traded well out of COVID, and we have a robust board in place. And certainly the integration of I suppose, the Corporate Governance Association into the family has really gone well. And as part of that tapestry, which is unfolding as we speak here today, we're happy to weave Mark into the conversation. He's very kind to give us his time. So really, these lunch and learns are kind of snapshots in terms of kind of what best practice is, what we're looking at over the last while, looking at the Uber trends coming down the line, and maybe getting a sense from practitioners at the cutting edge about where they see it from a consulting point of view. Today's kind of focus is very much on the corporate governance space, and I guess more generally as well, just to get a sense, Mark, of where you see, I suppose, next year going. So maybe if we take the ship of state out in the first instance, and maybe just ask you maybe to reflect a little bit on the year that's gone by, although we're not out of it yet, but
Yeah.
maybe just to kind of give me your sense of how the corporate governance landscape has evolved over the last year compared to, say, maybe previous years. And obviously we're coming out of the epoch of COVID and so on. But particularly maybe in terms of those big mega trends that you've seen, like diversity and ESG and so on. Maybe just give us a sense of where you see it at the moment over the last year.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again on behalf of Diligent BoardEffect for the opportunity to join the Lunch and Learn. And certainly someone who's joined your other Lunch and Learns, it's always a great opportunity just to get some insight from other IMCA practitioners. Certainly from our experience, what I've found is over the last year, and you're right, there has been this transition. People are starting to just reflect on the 2 years during COVID and really get kind of a baseline of where they are to go forward in 2024. Certainly, speaking to clients, the kind of conversations we are finding around ESG and board diversity is kind of intertwined. So when we speak to clients around ESG, there's kind of the three P's they talk about. They talk about people, planet, and purpose. And when they're looking at people, the conversations are around people internally, so looking at their internal stakeholders and how they can actually help them with the kind of the diversity challenges around the workforce and how that can impact their business. But also important from a kind of corporate governance perspective, they're talking about the board diversity and making sure that that aligns with the succession planning, the board skill set analysis. So that's been really important from a people perspective. Certainly on a planet, when we look at the ESG and the kind of three Ps, the conversations around how do they actually monitor and manage the reporting of their carbon footprint, for instance, the carbon footprint of their suppliers. So that third-party risk is one of the things that's becoming up more and more, and how they can actually manage and report on that. And certainly on a planet perspective and the purpose of an organisation, what we're finding organisations and boards and committees is actually have conversations about, right, okay, the purpose of our organisation is X, and how do we align that with our ESG strategy? So a lot of clients, particularly maybe if they're in a non-for-profit, charitable-based space, that is really acute for them because they're finding that they have to be really reflective and show transparency around their ESG and relating to what they maybe have donors or customers. So that's probably the kind of key findings were over the last 12 months or so. Oh.
That's interesting. I mean, and you mentioned third-party risk, and it is certainly one that we get a lot ourselves in terms of communications, and obviously with the CSRD regulations coming in and the reporting requirements kicking next January, which is only a couple of weeks away at this point, for entities over certain thresholds and so on, and in the week of COP28, when the world is pondering and reflecting on these affairs of ESG. I mean, does from an IT point of view, do you have any particular products coming in for addressing ESG or to assisting or courses or anything in that particular area for boards?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we do have our Diligent Institute, and they provide training programs around ESG, and certainly within Diligent, because we are the leading software as a service platform globally, and we focus on the three pillars of governance, risk, and compliance, and that certainly fits within the ESG strategy. And we work with clients from, companies listed in the stock exchange, state-based sector organisations, right through to non-profits. So yeah, absolutely, we provide. I suppose when we speak to clients, what they're looking for in technology is to get a level of clarity. Boards, as you're well aware, Pat, and everybody on this call listening, is they have a limited amount of time to manage those risks and that information. And certainly, there's not any slowing down of the data that the board and the committees have to review. So that clarity is really important, and that's where Diligent assists the organisations.
And that point you bring up is really pertinent in terms of time, Mark, because it's the one thing number one, bar none, when particularly in the charity space, if we're talking about Lionheart as a case in point when we're doing a program and so on, it's extraordinary as a continual bugbear where people just, the packs are getting bigger. And the reading time is increasing at a rate exponentially. And they're getting more complex and they're getting walls of data coming at them as opposed to kind of information. So there's a lot of data, but maybe not kind of chunked into readable and digestible information. So what sort of kind of products, for example, do you bring in terms of, Diligent and BoardEffect in terms of maybe addressing that and kind of allowing people to use their time more productively?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, certainly when we speak to clients, the vast majority of board meetings or committee meetings, they're around about between 2 and 5 hours. Some will be a little bit shorter, some will be a full day. And when we speak to clients, what they're looking for is a kind of single pane of glass relating to the data they need. So it's about from the board packs. Board packs over a number of years was increasing in pages and pages, and we still speak to clients who are issuing 300-400 page documents for the board or committee to review. And certainly what we find is the drive is now to actually reduce that, to
Yeah.
make it a little bit more easy to understand. The non-executive directors, their personas are changing. So historically, we found that a lot of clients had board members who were retired and maybe they had more time to reflect on that information. Now, more and more, it's people who are actually still working and they've got less time and they want that information so they can drill down and then review additional information. So yeah, certainly within BoardEffect, one of the key drivers when speaking to clients is they want packs easily accessible, either on their devices or
Yeah.
on laptops, but also important to have that ability to reflect on additional information. So when looking at things like risk register, code of conduct forms, board evaluation, succession planning, they want that capabilities to be at their fingertips instead of, as we all know, historically they were just put in as part of a large file.
And are you seeing kind of the evolution of dashboards or, for example, executive summaries kind of creeping up the radar? Or where do you see those fitting into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the executive summaries is one of the key things we're finding about is they want more information, but they want to and chunk size information so then they can delve down to it. I mean, certainly some of the insights we get from speaking to boards and committees is they want that summary information. And then when they're speaking to maybe business units to do kind of thoughtful questions, they're bringing in the business unit specialist to maybe have deep dives on a particular risk that's happening. But really, yeah, executive summary is the way forward. We're finding certainly over the last 18 months as we move into 2024 as well, Pat.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a great skill for a company secretary, particularly or to impose that discipline. But the gift of being able to write an executive summary is a wondrous thing to see it done right. And I do see it certainly going up the requirement totem pole for reports and consistency of reports coming in from, I suppose, the consumable audience, and particularly the non-executive director and trustee space. And I suppose going beyond that space to stakeholders, for example. Mark, I mean, stakeholder engagement is obviously a big piece of the corporate governance landscape now, and the role and influence of stakeholders, and particularly shareholders and employees and customers and clients and so forth. Their kind of power and potency has shifted to my mind over the last year. What are you seeing?
I mean, certainly if you divide them into three areas, when we look at stakeholders, what we're finding speaking to boards of directors, senior leadership teams, is stakeholders are now starting to, they're looking for information to confirm that around customer satisfaction. We
Okay.
did a recent survey, and I think it was 49% of directors were saying customer satisfaction is the best way to measure the company's performance. So that's
Okay.
interesting on its own. When we speak to shareholders, they're more asking about the long-term strategy. So that kind of aligns with the question around data and information is available. So shareholders want long-term strategy information. They want to know the financial reporting and performance of an organisation. And then certainly from a kind of employee aspect, they're looking at the kind of benefits. They're looking at things around, job satisfaction. And that kind of aligns into kind of macroeconomics when we speak to clients this year, Pat, around how interest rates are affecting organisations, the inflationary pressures it's putting on businesses, etc.
So, I mean, to that very point about risk management and kind of the risk register and risk statements and risk policies and that documents meet, we were coming out of Brexit. We thought that was the end of the world back in kind of 2019, beginning of 2020. Then March 2020 hit. The world, pivoted into a strange new universe. We came out of that, losing a few people along the way, but relatively intact, although we're still kind of trading through it, and went into an unthinkable situation where we have a European war going on effectively in the Ukraine, which is Europe for all intents and purposes. And then we're dealing with that, and suddenly the Middle East kicks off, and you have a difficult scenario going on down there. So, I mean, when you're looking at risk management, what sort of new types of risk, emerged from your perspective from, of course, the calendar year, or, how did this affect, what you're seeing in boards and corporate governance and the strategies in terms of boards' consumption of that kind of risk management kind of, I suppose, discipline and also their responsibilities in that space?
Yeah, I mean, certainly what we've found is within the kind of risk register, the risk management within the kind of corporate governance space is the feedback we're getting from directors is twofold. One, they're looking at risks that potentially are out with their control. So one of the main one top of the pile was interest rates this year has been the
Yeah,
main conversation about because there's something we really have to drill down on from a risk register perspective. Is it impacting on business loans? Is it impacting on inflationary pressure, which will impact an employee requesting additional, salary increases? So that was the one main one that came
cost
out
of
of.
living. Yeah.
Yep. The other one, of course, was labour costs because that aligns with interest rates, and then the regulatory environment. So those three were top of the risk register when we spoke to board of directors. Below that, it was more internal control pressures, things around cyber security.
And
Yes,
where did
you
cyber risk come into that risk register as a matter of interest?
pardon, sorry,
Where
what
did
was it?
cyber risk come in terms of the risk register as a matter of
Now,
interest?
the metrics are, on top of my head, I think cyber security was around about 20%, ESG was around about 24%, and then you're looking at interest rates, that type of thing, around kind of 40% of the kind of
Okay.
topic. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because when we were looking at it ourselves, it was slightly skewed towards cyber risk, but I
Mm.
suspect because in the Irish context particularly, you would have had the HC and Tusla hacks, which were significant, and they caused huge concern. And as a consequence of the data leak there, a lot of people have, including myself, a lot of people got hacked over the course of the last year. So cyber risk, particularly for entities both in the charitable space but in the regular space as well, was at the number one or two in terms of concerns over the period. Cost of living would have been, one, two, three, say maybe, and they'll go up and down contingent on where they were on the spectrum, but cyber risk, cost of living. And then, while it wasn't necessarily seen as a risk, ESG was certainly going up in terms of that whole kind of regulatory piece in terms of, where CSRD coming down or variables to that regard. Safeguarding is another major issue. This comes back down kind of and rightly so. So in terms of those sort of areas, in terms of the risk register, the technology that you have within, your own software, what kind of would you point to as a compelling competitive advantage for Diligent in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I speak to clients who deal with the risk register, and I've been on some conversational calls with clients, and what they tell us, the clients actually feedback from us is there's a plethora of information available to them, but really what they're sitting in is risk registers across different business units.
Yeah.
And it's really challenging for them to kind of filter up that information to the leadership team and, of course, the board. So I suppose really what we're seeing is to take a step back, when we think of the board and the kind of good governance procedures, is the board really should be like the lighthouse keeper, keeping an eye on the business, managing it through kind of stormy economic times and, navigating the leadership team as best they can. And they can't really do that when they're getting information bubbled up to the top level through spreadsheets and it's hard for them to manage it. So
Yeah.
what we're finding is organizations are transitioning to a platform-based view. So they can have that single source of pain of truth. And that's easily accessible through a kind of GRC platform within Diligent.
So that's an interesting term. I haven't heard that before. Pain of truth.
Mm.
Okay. What's just explain that one to me. It's very good. I kind of think I know what it is, but maybe just for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, it's really making sure that from the board level and the leadership team, they have that, they can actually see that lens to indicate where there is actual, red flags relating to the business. And then they've got clear line of sight of that, Pat. And that's really what we're finding is the board and the committees below that, they don't want to be blindsided with information that's not getting bubbled up to the top. And you know yourself and everybody on this call, there's been so many instances of reflective reviews of where a business has gone wrong, either in the state sector or private sector, and the board and committees will say they didn't have that level of information to make that decision. So it's making sure they do have that and make those difficult calls.
Okay, I've great resonance there on what you're saying. I'm minded of the kind of that separation of powers within the boards and the executive teams, and what's the old analogy of noses in and fingers out. But the pain of truth, maybe putting your hands in the wounds, very much in the environment we're operating in now, and certainly any board we've dealt with, that no surprises is probably the number one kind of metric that they have. It's not like wine that gets better with age. Bad news, they need to hear about it early. And that early warning system, I mean, what sort of trends are you seeing there for boards in terms of what are they putting in to kind of structure themselves so that they can have those sort of dashboards of early warning?
I mean, certainly what they're doing is they're making sure they get the right technology in place for the board. So again, diligently supporting that the organisations, irrespective of the size. Again, if you're through working the stock exchange, private company, state sector, or non-profit, we're making sure they've got the level of technology that's relevant to their risk strategy. And we provide that within our application suite as such, Pat.
Okay. And more maybe if we go outside our parochial footprint,
Mm.
Mark, for a moment and just reflect on the broader context of political trends, and I suppose in the week of COP28 as we're coming out of that and look at global trends for a moment. I mean, what notable global trends would you have seen or international developments, I suppose, over the last year, and maybe I suppose, those that have influenced where we're heading into next year in terms of, what you're seeing coming up in terms of 2024. What globally kind of, I suppose struck you in terms of that was a surprise, didn't see that coming, or, and then what's coming at us next year?
I think in relation to your COP28, I think that's quite interesting. You've actually mentioned that because I was reading an article, and I think this is quite interesting for the present, but also important for 2024. In India, as we all know, India is now one of the global powerhouses within the economy. And the market regulator in India recently introduced the listed 150 top listed companies that have to provide reasonable assurance around ESG practices. Now, the key word when you look at that from consultants on the call is reasonable assurances. So when you look at it from a global space, the vast majority of global economies will ask for limited assurance. Now, you'll know from your experience that reasonable assurance indicates that the organizations in these 150 listed companies in India have a global footprint. We're looking at companies like Tata, who will have offices in Cork and all around the world, and their steel factories and their car manufacturing. So they'll require now their auditors to check that supply chain to make sure it's fit for purpose on greenhouse emissions and other ESG regulations. Whereas the global economies are still looking at a limited assurance. So the thought process is, well, the driver for change within India on those ESG assurances actually move into a kind of global market. And that's key because, as you know, the limited assurance allows for the management to report on their ESG practices, where, of course, the reasonable assurance will ask for the auditors. So I don't know if that's an insight that might be of interest.
No, it is because I mean, obviously the CSRD is coming
Mm.
down the track at a rate of knots, and that's going to be a huge step change in terms of compliance and so on. And there are a few others following up with that. It's from a compliance perspective, it's only going one way, and it's going up in terms of that, and it's becoming the burden of administration and cost, is increasing exponentially in that regard. And I was, talking to some SMEs there recently, and they were making the observation that regardless if you're Tata or a small SME in Bangalore or Belmullet or Bognor Regis, you still have the same kind of expectation. There's no allowance for scale or size in that sort of some of that reporting, which is, to my mind, maybe a little bit unfair, given the carbon footprint, which might be on one side, it might be just a carbon glass slipper, on the other side, it could be a carbon jackboot, but you still have the same reporting regime. So from that perspective, where do you see, for example, the rise of AI assisting in that regard?
I think AI, again, when we're speaking to boards and leadership teams, what they're finding is they're still dipping their toe into the world of AI within their organisations.
Mm.
Um, and our initial findings are that AI has been certainly the conversation within AI at kind of board level has been kind of focused within and held accountable within the audit committee. As initial findings, we're finding they'll
All
have
right, that's
that,
interesting.
yeah, they'll have that level of responsibility. And then where it's relevant is getting bubbling up to the board. So certainly on a practical level, organisations are having discussions around, what is the kind of reasonable and ethical implementation of AI within their organisation, and then they'll have to make that decision call based on what we started the conversation around the input and influence of stakeholders, shareholders, and employees. And within the not-for-profit sector, maybe the sponsors as well, Pat.
And just within, for example, in the not-for-profit sector, particularly if we kind of move on from that in terms of just maybe for a moment reflect on subcommittees and committees, are you seeing any trend in new committees being established? Obviously you have your ARC and you might have your nominations. Are you seeing any new trends in committees being established?
Certainly the most like the ones we've seen more increase in trends has certainly been ESG. I think
Okay.
I think what I found is about 50% of ESG conversations were an agenda item on the board, and around about 22% now have either an ESG stroke sustainable committee. So that has been a quite a change over the last 3, 4, 5 years, Pat.
Okay.
But that's probably the one committee we're actually seeing more relevance, irrespective of not-for-profit, corporate governance, or within the kind of state sector as well.
And are you seeing cyber committees or cyber
Mhm.
security committees being brought in?
Well, not at the moment. What we've found is it's interesting because when we talk to clients and they say about regulatory compliance, that sometimes fits into that cyber security conversation because they're worried about the issues around cybersecurity, will it affect their data protection? Then, of course, that impacts on the regulatory compliance and potential fines. So we're not finding any organisation or many organisations who are having a dedicated cybersecurity committee. What we are seeing is a lot of conversations and reflection both from shareholders, and what they're looking for is more succession planning of the board
Yeah.
and the committees to make sure they've got that skill set to really drill down on those cybersecurity risks.
And just on committees, what's your sense of how often a committee should meet? Or what are you seeing in terms of the reflection per annum?
Um, Again, we've found that the vast majority of clients are having meetings, between 2 and 5 hours. Some clients are having a full day sessions, but they are at this moment in time still generally, quarterly based meetings divided up between the committees and the main board.
And would you see or would you have a sense that committee meetings are taking place the same day as board meetings, or are they concurrent or consecutive?
Generally, we've with clients is the committee meetings are certainly before the main board, and then whatever the main summaries are then getting filtered down to the board, just like you mentioned
Yeah.
during the session around that executive summary, and trying to make sure it's more detailed and more to the point regarding what should be highlighted to the main board.
Yeah, I mean, we would concur with that. We're seeing the ESG committees as being the primary one that's been established, and we're seeing a ramp up in that area. It would have traditionally kind of fallen into the arc over the last while, but they're now establishing standalone ones. And again, that whole point, I suppose, around diversity and inclusion, we're seeing a huge step change in terms of particularly gender, and the broader diversity is coming into play now in terms of people's backgrounds, or their cultural backgrounds, or their whatever their race. All the various different diversities are coming into play, and that's, you're seeing a richer kind of engagement in terms of independence of thought at board level, certainly over the period, which is welcome. If I ask you to, for a moment, Mark, take out that crystal ball from under the table there and polish it brightly and look into it. I mean, what sort of future challenges or opportunities, do you see kind of for organizations over, say, just the immediate 24 months ahead of us? I wouldn't say 12 months, because that's unfair. It'll go so quickly.
Mhm.
But over the next, say, 2 years, what are you looking at? What's your sense? What are you looking at? What's Diligent looking at? What's your sense of it?
I certainly think from the kind of challenges, the risk aspect is massive, and we're never going to see that reduce. I think the data we get is that there's got to be more and more information going into the committees and the board. So that's going to be a great challenge for them to actually sift through, make sure they get the right information to the right leadership team, and make those thoughtful discussions to help build and leverage the experience of the board. I mean, certainly over the last year, we've found a lot of boards are finding there's a disconnect still within a linkage between ESG and the company strategy. So that's an area of improvement for a lot of organisations. Certainly, on a more positive view, the ESG sector is going to be massive. I think the recent data indicated that the ESG assets is going to be worth something like $53 trillion by 2025. So that is going to
How much?
continue to be $53 trillion.
Wow.
I know. So I mean that's different assets around the globe. So organisations who are at the forefront of that and make sure the fit for purpose going through the next 12, 24, 36 months, they're going to be very well placed. And there's so much data coming out saying that organisations who have a strong ESG policy are striving and improving the results better than ones who do not.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, is there anything keeping you awake at night in terms of the future at the moment, from a Diligent
Um,
perspective?
yeah, I mean, I certainly think from speaking to clients, I think what we find is the things that keep me awake is the same things it's always done. And certainly when you mentioned the start of the call about the COVID, what that is taught, we find speaking to boards is that it's a very small global economy when it gets down to it. We always thought prior to 2020, we always worked in our own individual countries, and it has taught, I think, all boards and committees that you're only a couple of weeks away from potential challenges either through supply chain, cyber security issues, etc. So the key thing keeping boards and committees awake at night is not having the right data to make sure they can make informed choices, Pat.
No, I think I would certainly agree, and and on that note, I'm very thankful for your time. I'm conscious it's a lunch and learn, and people have to get their grub in. But I mean, when we just look back over the conversation, I suppose the key points that jump to mind is that increasing importance of executive summaries. I guess we'd agree on that, and the consistency of reports and so forth, and I suppose the shifting power and influence of stakeholders, particularly in terms of customers and clients and so on, and their need for more data in terms of the reports that are coming out to them. Those external factors we discussed in terms of particularly interest rates and the geopolitical situation changing has been extraordinarily fast moving. I mean, who would have seen, or I know the old adage of the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, but we're really in here be demon uncharted territory sort of waters. And certainly interest rates and the cost of living has had a catastrophic effect on a lot of charities and NGOs in that space. But it all boils down to the age old cunard of boards having access to accurate and timely information to enable them to make effective decisions. Mark, I'm guessing at the heart of things, and be it the rise of ESG at one point, or the elevation of cyber risk on the other point, the challenges organizations universally face in managing, I suppose, and analyzing the risks and the large amount of data is not diminishing anytime soon. So I think, you know, you're going to be busy for the future in terms of assisting boards and hopefully working in tandem with ourselves here in the Institute. So as we say in Gaelic, Gramila Mahagat, a Caragalair. Thank you to all the people that have dialed in, and also those that will be watching it later on YouTube on our channel. Looking forward, as I say, to the quarterly events with Diligent over the year ahead, and that in-person event, which is going to be very exciting, and we'll bring that news to you as we send out our details in January. But in the meantime, on behalf of everyone here today in the Institute, all that were listening and attending, I want to say thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure. Always interesting to catch up from, I suppose, with yourselves at the cutting edge in terms of corporate governance, and we look forward to working with you in the new year. So I know it's a little bit early, and it is the 6th of December, and traditionally the 8th would be the one that we would note here, but we wish you and your family a happy Christmas and a healthy new year. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Pat.
God bless.
You too.